I've been experimenting with FSX for about 5 years now, and I've tried all manner of hardware bits and bobs along the way, and more often than not it's a very poor compromise. Buttons and switches in particular. I've had Cytec panels, I've got a VR Insight panel at the moment, and I'm not knocking these things. Some of them add some value to the sim, but they're usually lacking, shall we say. They never seem to, well, certainly they don't match exactly the kind of buttons and switches you need for any given aircraft, and you always end up with some fairly unsatisfactory compromise, and more often than not they don't actually get used at all for those reasons, because they're such a poor compromise, shall we say. And it's always been in my mind to assemble some sort of comprehensive cockpit control system, ideally with no need to touch the mouse or even have a keyboard within arm's length, but I've never got round to that until now. But now's the time, I think. I've pretty much decided that's what I'm going to do, and I'm just keeping a record of it here because it might be quite interesting, to see what I'm doing along the way. Why now? Well, recently I've acquired a new aircraft. That's the AeroSoft Twin Otter Extended, and I didn't have great hopes for this aircraft. I buy a lot of aircraft, as many enthusiasts do, and by and large I take them around the block a couple of times and then just never fly them again, or I use them in a video. I mean, I'm not, that's mostly what I do in FSX, frankly, is has been making videos, and I do enjoy that, but I want to do a bit of serious flying, and this might be the aircraft that I want to nail down, really, because I did buy the original Twin Otter a few years ago, and very disappointed. I mean, it's the right kind of aircraft, but it was it was a very old implementation, and coming to it after some of the more high quality payware was just really disappointing. So I didn't do anything with that, frankly. But this one, they've completely revamped it. They've re-implemented the Twin Otter, and it's very much more sophisticated in terms of certainly its visual model. But it's got a beautiful virtual cockpit. But more importantly, perhaps it's got a lot of the systems are modelled at first sight in quite a lot of detail. So, and I've flown it around enough to decide. I mean, again, it's not completely modelled in all the details. Some of the stuff that appears to be modelled actually isn't modelled at all. I'm going to review this aircraft, in fact, and going to probably harp back on to some of the things I was saying in my Catalina review 4.5 years ago. Something about this aircraft made me think, this is the one that I'm going to spend a bit of time with, and it's really frustrating trying to do that by clicking tiny buttons in the virtual cockpit while squinting, because your tracker is trying to move all of the deal, really. But someone's done quite a lot of work behind the scenes to do some LUA stuff and produce a package for Linda, which is an add-on that basically sits on top of FSU IPC, and in a nutshell gives you access to many, if not all, of the control switches and buttons and knobs in the virtual cockpit, in a way that allows you to map them to hardware controls, so switches and buttons and so on a hardware panel. Now this makes it a realistic proposition to try to construct something that allows you to fly this aircraft hands off. And so I looked into that, and the more I looked into that, the more I became enthusiastic about it. I did have in the back of my mind the Leo Bodnar switch and joystick controller boards, which you can buy. They're about £30 each, And so I had a look at them, and you know, pretty soon it was clear to me that's the solution. You know, I'll get a fistful of those boards, or however many I need, a whole bunch of toggle switches, buttons, you name it really. Plug them all together, and most importantly, you know, lay out these switches on a panel or panels that are at least reminiscent of the actual Twin Otter panels. And you know, I can mount an overhead panel. I can have, you know, just to tailor it really to what I want. And that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. I put some time into. Last week, I spent the whole of last weekend. Well, not the whole of it. A lot of time last weekend coming up with. Well, I mean, analysing. I don't know how well you can see that on this. Analysing the panels that I'm going to need to implement. So that's basically the front. The sort of, you know, what's in front of you in the Twin Otter, and I've split it into a number of sub panels. You know, counted up how many switches are on there, and so on. You know, just loads of detail. What I've ended up doing is same with the overhead panels. There they are. What I've ended up doing is designing a sort of slimmed down approximate version of some of that. You know, some of it you can chuck away because it's not implemented, or it's stuff that's kind of, you know, fake. Like some of the switches will work, you know, they'll flip and make a noise, but they don't actually do anything. Some of the systems, well, there's still a question in my mind about some of the systems, to what extent, or even if they're modelled at all. I mean, for example, the one thing you know, some of them are pointed out in the manual. The aileron trim has buttons and an indicator, but it's actually not implemented, whereas the rudder trim is implemented. So anyway, some of this you can chuck away, and you can combine some of the panels. Anyway, I'm going on. So this is what is this? That's a panel that's hopefully going to encompass all the autopilot controls, but also I think down here we've got rotary controls for everything on the, well, more or less everything on the panel that needs a rotary control. These are going to be encoders, rotary encoders, and they're things for setting the heading bugs, ADF, I don't know what you call that, pointer, or the moving the ADF card. The nav 1 and nav 2 OBI, omni bearing indicators. The Colesman window adjustment for the altimeter, all that sort of stuff. So that's going to be on there. That's one, if you like, sub panel. That's going to be somewhere in front of me. And then we've got on this page, there's, I don't know how you can see this, we've got the fire panel, which is modelled in some detail. So we've got fire extinguishers if we have an engine hot start or an engine fire in flight, and the fuel management panels on there as well. What else have we got? Here's the that's the GPS and navigation equipment. So now you've got to keep in mind this is going to be an odd sort of panel layout, because although it's a facsimile in some sense of the real Twin Otter panel, it's not going to have any of the gauges on. So this is input only, with one exception. Right in the middle of this screen, we've got the GPS. Now that is going to be again an actual. It's a screen. You know, but I've basically got a 7-inch VGA screen, which is nominally a touch screen, but honestly I can't get it to work properly, and so I'm not bothered about it being a touch screen. So what I'm doing is implementing the GPS with all the buttons that it needs around the outside. So this is quite a sophisticated system modelled in this this aircraft. It's the Garmin GNS 530, which is essentially gives you similar functionality to the built-in GPS in FSX, but also adds in it manages the nav 1 and Com1 radios, and also some of the flight director stuff. It all integrates really well. So so that's going to be an actual gauge, if you like, on the panel. That's the only one, and everything you need to control that is going to be there. It's actually manipulated by 2 concentric rotary controls, which I'm going to have. Those can be plugged into the bottom of boards without any problem. I haven't done any of this yet, so that's the theory. So that's going to be controllable exactly like it is in real life, but everything else on there is input only. So that, I've got to tinker with how that's going to look. So on the rest of this particular panel, for example, we've got well, actually I'm not going to have the Com and Nav 2 radio. Ideally I would have that, but that requires 2 more of those dual concentric controls, and they're £20 each. And actually I've got a Cytec radio panel that can be the Com2 and Nav2 radios, so there's no point in doing it. I'm going to leave that out. But we've got the ADF radio panel, and we've got the DME panel under there, and also the comms audio panel, which is partially implemented in the Twin Otter. So we're going to have that as well, and that's what I've been doing. I've spent a lot of time, going through that, trying to get a rational, approximate layout, and totting up what I need. And yeah, and when you count all those things up, it's something like 124 separate switches required. So, but still, 124 switches. You can imagine trying to do that on a collection of random VR Insight boards, or you can hook these things with something like Linda onto a Cytec switch panel, but you just end up with a dog's dinner, really. So that's what I've spent last weekend doing. Sunday evening I sat down and spent an hour or so transmitting off various orders, having spent several more hours looking at how I could get hold of some of the switches I needed and what kind of switches to order, and that's where we are. So in a nutshell, we're going to have a Twin Otter extended, more or less authentic-ish hybrid cockpit, which is going to be flyable without, once it's up and running, without the mouse or the keyboard, brakes off to brakes on, if you like. In fact, not even that. Cold and dark to cold and dark without the mouse or keyboard. It's going to be a hybrid kind of cockpit. I'm going to be using a ultra wide display with track IR. Going to be using a genuine realistic yoke. I'm using the Elite yoke, but no gauges by and large on the panels. It's input only. So some people will look at that and say, oh, it's not realistic, but nothing is in this game until you get into big money. I have an idea that this is also going to give me much more of a sense of enclosure, being in a cockpit. I'm going to have overhead panels. Going to probably mount the throttles, power levers, shall we call them, and so on, more or less in the orientation and position that they are in the real Twin Otter, which is overhead, kind of here. The overhead panel is going to be there as well, and And what I might do is try to just extend that slightly to give me a sense of enclosure. My current plan is to have these panels backlit as well. If you fire up the, I don't have the thing running at the minute, but if you fire up the Twin Otter extended and you switch on the panel lights and it's dusk or dark, it really is, really is a very attractive sight, shall we say, if you're a nerd like I am. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that live, in real life, and I think it's going to work well. I know how I'm going to do it, by and large. I'm not going to say anything much about that, but that's part of what I'm going to be doing with this blog. Really, is just having a look at how that goes. So there we are, day 1 of the Twin Otter cockpit project. More as it happens.